generations, people have been predicting that the human population would grow past its capacity to feed itself and would deplete essential resources, and we would collapse in some manner of calamity with a mixture of starvation and warfare and just disaster. And yet every time we get close, technology somehow pulls our bacon out of the fire. And so we now are 7 billion and growing and heading towards 10 billion easily within your lifetime. Okay? And we keep finding the resources to keep ourselves growing. And we probably always will. It's not the resource limitation that's going to get us. It's the complexity of the problems we create in the process of getting those resources that are going to get us. Now, I'm going to start with a fairly simple case study. Colony collapse disorder of honeybees. Okay, honeybees are important pollinators of our food crops, and their populations have been collapsing catastrophically over much of the northern hemisphere, where most of the agriculture happens. These are some of the factors that have been identified as contributing to the collapse of these bee populations. And a recent report from a major scientific organization came to the conclusion they're all involved. Every one of them contributes to the problem. The report also noted, this is how science studies these things. Gee, I wonder how pesticide A affects the bees. And then this guy over there, gee, I wonder how pesticide B affects the bees. This is how these things actually affect the bees. They all affect the bees together, simultaneously, and we can't study them. And it's even more than this. They not only all affect the bees together, they affect each other. The fungicide makes the pesticides more toxic. The fungicides and pesticides diminish the immune systems of the bees, making them more susceptible to diseases. When we convert natural habitats to cropland, the bees lose their natural habitat and they're forced to forage in the agricultural crops where we spread the pesticides. And on top of that, the pollen that they derive from the crop plants is actually rotten food. So they're malnourished, which further reduces their immune function. And then on top of that, climate change will almost certainly result in continued loss of their natural habitats. Who cares? These are the things that require bee pollinators. My particular favorites are coffee and cocoa for chocolate. Okay? Thank God they're not necessary for wine and beer. Okay? Nonetheless, bees pollinate 10% of the food in the human food supply. And they account for $200 billion worth of agricultural production worldwide. So here's a question. What do we do when the bees aren't here anymore? Imagine the price of almonds or walnuts or blueberries if they have to be hand pollinated by humans. Now, the basic premise of my talk is that nature does so much for us. And what we have been doing in our search for more and more resources to feed an ever-growing population is we have been diminishing the capacity of nature to do these things for us. And then we've had to take over the management of those things. So what I'm talking about is something called ecosystem services. The natural world provides us with food because plants capture solar radiation and put it into a form that we can use it. The natural world creates soils that support the plants in producing the food that we eat. The natural world buffers our temperature extremes and flooding and creates a more moderate environment that is more suitable for our comfort. The natural world does all of these things in a way that promotes human safety, security, and well-being. And when we diminish the natural world in our pursuit of ever more food to support ever larger populations, we have to take over management of these things. When we were few and hunter-gatherers, nature provided all the food we needed in plants and game animals. When we grew too far, we had to take over, covering the planet in our croplands. The human population consumes 40% of all plant productivity on the planet. And that was an estimate back in the 1990s. We have to manage the animals now because the game animals are depleted by overhunting. Nature provides us with clean water. And yet, as our demands for water become greater and greater, we have to take over managing water, damming it, channeling it, bringing it to where we want, so we can irrigate the crops we need in places where it's too dry to grow crops. And yet this irrigation is depleting groundwater throughout the world. We are treating groundwater like oil, not like a renewable resource. When you draw it out faster than it's replenished by natural seepage. All of these green areas are areas where the groundwater table is dropping. And the red areas, it's dropping by as much as a foot per year. And many of these areas, in particular the high plains of the United States, are major crop producing regions. What happens when the groundwater is gone? 95% of the water use in the Great Plains of the United States is for irrigation for agriculture. Nature used to provide nutrient recycling. The soil organisms would recycle the nutrients from the dead organic matter back into the soil to be reused by the next generation of plants. We grow crops on land so intensively we've had to take over complete control of the nutrient cycle. Every year we have to fertilize the crops. And we put so much fertilizer down at a continental scale. We are saturating the natural world with our nutrients. And when these nutrients, when we farm the land too intensively, we have degraded the soil to the point where it's practically sterile. Food won't grow unless we fertilize it. And that fertilizer ends up in our water bodies, creating algae blooms that coat the entire coasts of some countries. And those algae blooms create dead zones where fish and shellfish populations collapse. It also degrades water quality in our fresh water so that the water becomes unusable for recreational purposes. And some of the algae species that are blooming are actually toxic. They produce neurotoxins, and if you swim in the water, you feel numbness and tingling. And so this is Grand Lake St. Mary just across the Ohio border, and you can't swim in Grand Lake St. Mary anymore because of the nutrient saturation. And now, we're changing the very climate. Where nature has kept that climate in a balance for the past 10,000 years, it's allowed for human civilization to prosper. We are now changing that climate, and people are beginning to propose that we take over managing that. By either managing solar radiation with mirrors out in space, or managing the carbon dioxide and gaseous composition of the entire atmosphere to regulate that by human technology. And scientists are already warning, yes, we have the technology to do this. What we don't have is the understanding to predict the consequences. So, with this sort of overview, this is a paraphrase of something someone else has said. Nature is not just more complex than we can understand. Nature is more complex than we can imagine. And when we're in a situation like this, we're like children taking the back off our parents' smartphone, monkeying around with stuff we don't understand with no idea what happens when we pull out a piece. And so perhaps the discreet way to proceed is with humility and discretion and not take on more than we can chew. Now, some people have proposed that we could just turn this over to artificial intelligence. We can't handle it, so we'll just make a computer that can. And yet, Elon Musk of SpaceX and Tesla, Bill Gates, Stephen Hawking, the astrophysicist, a subject of a recent movie, one of the smartest men on the planet, they are all together warning that you cannot put human welfare under the control of machines, or it can become an existential threat. And if you've seen Terminator and any of a number of such dystopian movies, you understand the nature of the problem that they are suggesting. There's yet another layer of complexity, and that is we are complex. And cooperation is a heck of a lot easier said than done. And so at the national level, when we try to address environmental problems, we have to deal with a whole layer cake of issues. Class distinctions determine who benefits from environmental degradation and who pays the cost, who's exposed to the consequences. It's always the rich get better and the poor get the shaft. We like to think we're in a democracy, and yet the richest among us spend hundreds of millions of dollars to influence our political system to their benefit. So while it looks like we have a democracy, do we? Is the good of the whole being the main motivation of our leaders? This gets even worse when you go to the international level. Who caused the problem? We can't get past this with the global climate change negotiations. Who caused the problem? The Western countries caused the problem. Who's going to contribute the most to the future carbon emissions to the atmosphere? India and China, who say, we didn't start this, we didn't do this, how come we have to limit our development to make up for your mistakes in the past? And yet if they do that, we're all toast. Selfish interest. The rich countries can't get past the idea that we're competing with India and China. And so if we go with more expensive, cleaner energy, and we let the Indians and the Chinese use the older, dirtier, cheaper technologies, we give them an economic advantage. And who's going to do that? So the complexity of the human interaction and the human ecosystem begs the question, are we as a species that evolved from primates who seek constant self-advantage and dominance, are we as a species capable of cooperation at the global scale? My idea, the kernel of my idea here is, the answer is in efforts to reduce the complexity that we have to deal with. And so, this is a fair, I don't know if I have this forward or backward, but act locally, think globally. Cooperation is most easily done when you do it in small groups. Because in small groups, people know each other. There's less us versus them, and more, we're all in this together. You're more likely to get cooperation amongst people at the local level. Now the problem with this is, of course, every locality is potentially in competition with every other locality for economic advantage and what have you. And so you can't just leave it to the locals. There has to be a global framework, but that global framework needs to be simple. Let the multitude of decisions that have to be made be done mostly at the local level, but at the global level, there have to be accepted conventions, accepted principles that constrain global action. My short list, and people could come up with others: don't export the problem. Take care of it yourself. Don't pass on your problems to the next generation. Take care of it yourself. As much as possible, meet your local needs locally. And if you have to get something from someplace else, fair trade should be the guiding principle. And lastly, don't damage the natural systems that are doing most of the complicated work keeping this planet livable. So the problem that we've created for ourselves is we have transferred a substantial amount of the complexity of keeping the human population going from nature into the human sphere, where we have to think about it and manage it. And the answer is, don't do that. Let nature be as complex as it can possibly be and perform the functions that nature has performed for millions of years, and in doing so, we reduce the burden that humanity has to manage and potentially screw up, so that the whole system maintains itself and humans prosper.